So I'm sorry we are very late, you guys. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I was working with the president on something, and he wanted me to hand this out to you all, and I have it here, so I want to read it to the American public directly from the president. It has been suggested that we should rename as many as 10 of our legendary military bases, such as Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Benning in Georgia, and the list goes on. These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom. The United States of America trained and deployed our heroes here and won 2 world wars. Therefore, my administration will not even consider the renaming of these magnificent and fabled military installations. Our history as the greatest nation in the world will not be tampered with. Respect our military. So that was directly from the president. We spent some time working on that, and I wanted to deliver that to you. Also, I wanted to take us through a few other things relating to the coronavirus. First, the coronavirus task force briefing was held yesterday. I was in it, and there was some very good news that I'd like to share with you. I don't know if you all saw, there were 2 studies that came out, very strong studies in the journal Nature. And in Europe, which had a very similar epidemic profile to the United States, 3.1 million lives were saved due to mitigation and the efforts taken by the European governments. And as Dr. Birx noted to me, she sent this to me just before I walked out here, she said it suggests that the United States also prevented over 3 million deaths, thanks to the efforts of President Trump and the American people. Another study found that the shutdown efforts prevented 50 million additional coronavirus cases. So those are 2 very encouraging studies underscoring the work of the American people. Also, the Washington Post noted that these 2 reports use completely different methods to reach similar conclusions. They suggest that the aggressive and unprecedented shutdowns were effective at halting the exponential spread of the novel coronavirus. So thank you, Washington Post, for that good reporting. The Department of Agriculture, Secretary Sonny Perdue, also had some very good news in the task force briefing I was at yesterday. America's meatpacking facilities, at one time it looked like they were going to need to close. That was unacceptable to the administration. So we took action. The coronavirus task force took action. And now I'm pleased to report that these meatpacking facilities are operating at 95% capacity compared to 2019. We have beef operating at 98% capacity, pork at 95%, and poultry at 98%. Throughout America's extraordinary efforts to slow the spread, President Trump ensured that the meat supply chain stayed functional and robust by directing these meatpacking facilities to safely operate in accordance with the CDC and OSHA guidelines. His efforts secured America's continual access to a steady food supply chain. And then finally, and very importantly, I have some great data points to share on coronavirus testing capacity in minority communities. Admiral Brett Joie shared this with me yesterday and last night as well. He said that when we look at testing sites, President Trump's public-private partnership with retail companies has proven quite successful. Testing sites are operating in 49 states, with 70% of these sites located in communities with moderate to high social vulnerabilities. And social vulnerability takes into account race, ethnicity, housing and economics, language barriers, and other factors. Also, federally qualified health centers, their FQHCs, serve 29 million patients in 12,000 communities across the nation. They provide care to 1 in 5 of those uninsured, 1 in 5 of rural Americans, 1 in 3 of individuals below the poverty line, and more than 1.3 million homeless men and women, and nearly 1 million migrant agricultural workers. And 92% of these FQHCs now offer COVID tests, and we've awarded them $583 million to 1,385 of these facilities. And finally, I promised my last announcement. The HHS Office of Minority Health issued a competitive funding opportunity to build a strategic network of national, state, territory, tribal, local, and community-based organizations that deliver vital health information and support linkages to services for racial and ethnic minorities. And this announcement, this network is scheduled to be awarded at the end of June and is expected to reach at least 40 million individuals from racial and ethnic minorities. These updates, I was told by Brett Joie, were received very well at the Senate hearings. And we thank the Vice President, Mike Pence, for doing an amazing job leading our coronavirus task force, and to President Trump, who has led in bringing America through the coronavirus pandemic. And with that, I'll take questions. Kristen.
Kayleigh, thank you so much. Does the president regret tweeting out a baseless conspiracy theory about a 75-year-old protester on the morning of George Floyd's funeral?
The president was asking questions about an interaction in a video clip he saw, and the president has the right to ask those questions.
But does he regret tweeting out this protester was assaulted?
The president does not regret standing up for law enforcement men and women across this country. And let me say this, and just give you a little bit about the mindset behind the president's tweet. Look, we're living in a moment that is, it seems to be reflexively anti-police officer. And it's unacceptable to the president. In this tweet that he sent out, he was in no way condoning violence. He was not passing judgment on these two officers in particular. But what he was saying is this: when we see a brief snippet of a video, it's incumbent upon reporters and those who are surveying the situation to ask questions. Rather,
upon the president to have facts before he tweets anything out. He's the president of the United States.
the president did have facts before he tweeted it out that undergirded his questions.
Baseless conspiracy theory. Do
It's
you
not a
acknowledge
baseless
that?
conspiracy. No, not at all. I won't acknowledge that because look, let's contrast this to the George Floyd situation, which that horrific video that we all saw. Every single police officer that I saw across the country came out and said, this is an inexcusable action, and I condemn this police officer. In this case, there were 57 police officers who said, I resign in protest over the way these two officers were handled. And the president says, those law enforcement officers have a right to be heard.
But does the president
John.
think that anything justifies that 75-year-old man being pushed down to the ground like we all saw?
The
in
president
video?
does not condone violence. He wants to see the appropriate amount of police force used in any given situation, including this one, but he believes that the officers have a right to be
And very
heard.
quickly, George Floyd's brother is here testifying. Has the White House invited him here to meet with the president?
The president has repeatedly acknowledged George Floyd, his passing, the egregiousness of that atrocity, and has called the family by phone, as he did last week. Yes.
The president has got an event tomorrow in Dallas at a church in which he'll meet with faith leaders. He'll also meet with law enforcement officials, small business owners. The theme is a plan for holistic revitalization and recovery. Will the president be announcing any policy in regards to police reform tomorrow, and what might that policy form?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. And as it stands currently, the president has spent the last 10 days quietly and diligently working on proposals to address the issues that the protesters have raised across the country, legitimate issues. And that body of work, I'm told, is reaching its final edits, and we hope to produce it for you in the coming days. I can't promise you it's tomorrow, but in the coming days, we look to deliver that.
So what then will tomorrow be about? Will it be a listening session as he had on Monday with law enforcement, or might there actually be some concrete policy proposals?
Yeah, it will be a round.
It could at least be done at the executive level.
It will be a roundtable, much like what you saw with law enforcement officers earlier in the week.
And if I could just stay on that theme for a second, in terms of reform ideas that the president could support, Democrats have floated some in the House. Senate Republicans, led by Tim Scott, are working on others, things like banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants, independent process to investigate misconduct. Could the president support issues like that?
So again, don't want to get ahead of the announcements. What I would say is each issue is being looked at as to what would make a difference. Everything that you've suggested has certain ramifications, so he has to look at each of these in great detail as he's done over the last few days. And I would just note one thing that AG Barr said was that in the Democrat bill, they talked about needing to reduce immunity to go after bad cops, but that would result in police pulling back. So that is one thing that is a non-starter.
So is that, it's called qualified immunity.
Yes.
Is that a red line for the president?
That's a non-starter in the Democrat legislation. Yes, John.
Does the president believe there's a problem with institutional racism in this country and institutional racism in law enforcement?
Look, I've answered this question. I think this is the fourth time I've been asked it, and I've said each and every time, there are injustices that we have seen. Clearly, that tape of George Floyd was inexcusable, gut-wrenching, difficult to watch, and it was really a beautiful funeral yesterday, all the great testimonies to his life. We recognize those injustices. Sandra Bland, another example. But this president knows fundamentally that most police officers in this country are good, that the 750 men and women that have been injured, that David Dorn, the police officer who was killed, and Patrick Underwood, the law enforcement officer who was killed, are emblematic of what police in this country stand for. That is the best, that is the brightest, and that is our domestic heroes. Yes.
The reason why I'm asking it now is, does he believe that action needs to be taken to fundamentally change the way law enforcement is done in this country, to make fundamental changes so that there isn't the kind of disparities that we see along racial lines?
Well, the president's looking at various proposals, and I would say this president has done a whole lot more than Democrats have ever done when it comes to rectifying injustices, where you had the crime bill of the 90s, which created great racial disparities in our justice system, and President Trump rectified some of those with the First Step Act. So President Trump's about action, and he's shown that, and he recognizes injustices and acts promptly when he sees them. Yes.
Thanks,
Does
Kayleigh.
the President agree with the recent announcements from the Marines and Navy about their policies banning the display of the Confederate flag?
So I haven't spoken to him on that specific one. He does, as I noted at the top of this briefing, fervently stand against the renaming of our forts, these great American fortresses where literally some of these men and women who lost their lives as they went out to Europe and Afghanistan and Iraq and all across this world to win world wars on behalf of freedom. A lot of times the very last place they saw was one of these forts. And to suggest that these forts were somehow inherently racist and their names need to be changed is a complete disrespect to the men and women who the last bit of American land they saw before they went overseas and lost their lives were these forts.
Just one follow-up.
Yes, Jeff.
So an ex-judge appointed to review the Flint case said the Justice Department has engaged in highly irregular conduct to benefit a political ally of the president, and he urged the presiding judge in the case to deny an attempt by the government to dismiss the charges. What is the White House reaction?
That's the first I'm hearing of that. I'd point you to DOJ on that. Jeff.
Thanks, Kayleigh. Congressional Republicans, including Congresswoman Liz Cheney, have criticized the president's decision to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Germany. Some saying that it will embolden Russia if the United States does that. Did the president make that decision to punish Chancellor Merkel for deciding not to come to the G7 in June?
Look, I have no announcements on that front, and he never makes decisions to punish certain world leaders. He acts in the best interest of the United States.
Just
Yes.
follow up on another issue on
Yeah.
distance with regard to the tweet. One of the things that the president said in his tweet was that the gentleman fell harder than he was pushed. How does that work in terms of physics?
Look, the president raised several questions based on a report he saw. He has a right to ask those questions, and where he stands is squarely with law enforcement. He was making no judgments, not condoning violence, not saying what happened in this case with these two officers was right or wrong, but he's standing back and saying we need to ask questions before we destroy lives and convict people in the court of public opinion. Yes.
Thanks, Kayleigh. 2 questions on the economy. First of all, both the chair of the Federal Reserve and Steve Mnuchin said today the U.S. will definitely need another round of stimulus. How urgent is that for the president? I mean, how soon do we expect him to meet with Democrats to discuss the next legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question. He met on a potential Phase 4 policy last week. It was a very promising discussion with his economic advisors. So that's in the works as to when and if we see that, but it is a topic of discussion. He was encouraged by the jobs report. We were supposed to lose 7.5 million jobs. We ended up gaining 2.5 million, a swing by 10 million. It was described to me as one of the, by one famed economist, as one of the worst miscalculations of economists in history, to be off by 10 million. That's the size of Michigan. So the president's encouraged because what we're seeing is a belief in the Trump economy and the Trump presidency. What we're seeing is the market soar. We're seeing the S&P have its best 50-day track record in history because they believe in a president that has free market policies that got us to the hottest economy in modern history and will get us there again. Yes.
On that, the Federal Reserve today offered a pretty grim economic outlook, saying unemployment is going to be elevated for years. And also this week, we heard from the National Bureau of Economics research saying that the U.S. officially entered a recession. What is the White House response to that?
We believe that next month's jobs report will be robust. The president has been clear that Q4, he expects Q3 to be a transition period, Q4 to be robust, and next year to be a very hot year. And I would note that those in the prediction business, they were off by 10 million. That's not too good. So I'd go back and look at some of the models that were off and how extraordinary the jobs report was last time, including 300,000 new jobs for Black Americans. Yes.
Thank you so much. The president met with Mitch McConnell today, we understand. Can you kind of fill us in on what that discussion was about? Any updates?
So I have no announcements on that front. Those were his private meetings, so no announcements out of that.
Can I just add to Jonathan's question? You know, a lot of people are concerned that there is, you mentioned justice disparities. There's a lot of concern of some Americans that police officers treat black individuals and people of color differently than white individuals. Does the president share those specific concerns?
Here's what he's concerned about. He's concerned about what and I've told you he's addressed injustices with Sandra Bland and George Floyd and has repeatedly acknowledged that. But here is, in addition to that, his concern, put very well by New York's Police Benevolent Association President Mike O'Meara. Our legislators are failing us. Our press is vilifying us. He's saying us as police officers, stop treating us like animals and thugs. We've been vilified, and it's disgusting. When you have a sitting congressman, Ilhan Omar, calling cops cancer, what do you think that leads to? The AP reported on a shooting in front of a police department today in California. Let's stop vilifying our officers. Let's recognize injustice where we see it, but recognize all of us in here are safe because of our police officers doing their job each and every day.
I understand that, but there are concerns among many Americans that people of color are not treated the same by police, and that is what many of the protests have been about. Does the president share those specific concerns?
The president believes most of our police officers are good, hardworking men and women, like David Dorn, who was killed among these riots, like Patrick Underwood, who was killed among these riots. Those are our police officers. They are our best. They are our brightest. They are absolute places of injustice. We're addressing those. We're looking at legislative proposals and EOs, and what ultimately is determined, we'll see in the coming days as to what will work as a policy prescription. But stop vilifying our officers, because they deserve better than that. They're out there. They're working hard. 750 injured just in the last week and a half, and we need to recognize that. Yes.
Back on the Buffalo protester, is the president disappointed that more Republicans have not lined up to support the questions he asked, to use your characterization of it? Many people also characterize it as a conspiracy theory. And secondly, has the president reached out either to the injured gentleman or to the police officers involved?
So first of all, President Trump, I would say, he's not focused on what Republicans are saying or not saying on the Hill. He's focused on making changes. As I said, he's been diligently hard at work the last 10 days, and that is where his focus squarely lies at the moment. Yes.
Thanks, Kayleigh. And has he reached out to either the gentleman or the...
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Consider it?
Not that I'm aware of. Hello.
Thanks,
Yes.
Kayleigh. You started this briefing reading off some statistics about success of mitigation efforts on the spread of COVID, but we're now seeing a spike in cases in more than a dozen states and increased hospitalizations in a lot of those as well. So, and many public health experts attribute these spikes to Memorial Day weekend gatherings and other aspects of the reopening process before these mass protests. So why is President Trump continuing to urge reopening given this trend, and should we be slowing down a little bit on the reopening process as we see cases spike?
First, let me know as it pertains to Memorial Day. A week ago today, the vice president's team told me, I wasn't in task force that day, but that it was said that in fact that there was no linkage to Memorial Day as being some point of spurring wild outbreaks and rises across the nation. What I would say though, I talked to Dr. Birx and she said what we've seen is that in general, April averaged out to be about 30,000 cases a day. May was about 25,000 cases a day. Currently, we're at around 20,000 cases a day. And you've got to look in a nuanced way at each of these states. Like, for instance, Texas is one of the places where they're saying we're seeing a steady slope, not a huge rise, but part of it's in due to the fact that they're testing in long-term care facilities and in prisons, and the more testing you do, the more cases you identify.
Can I ask a follow-up? Sure. President Trump is planning to restart campaign rallies within the next few weeks. What sort of precautions is he going to be taking at his rallies for the safety of the rally-goers?
So we have no rallies announced just yet. You're right about the 2-week timeline that was put forward. But we will ensure that everyone who goes is safe, but no specific announcements on that front. And I would direct you to the campaign for more information on that. Yes.
Yes, thanks for taking my question. Owen Jensen with EWTN News. We've seen thousands of people in the streets protesting, exercising their constitutional right, those of course doing it peacefully. At the same time, churches in many cases told to limit their gatherings, in some cases to 10 or no more. Does the president see a double standard there, constitutionally speaking? And if, can you explain, please?
There are absolute double standards that we've seen, and that's why the Justice Department set up a task force, if you will, or a group to look at civil liberties as during coronavirus shutdowns. I read about one case where you had an allowance of outside gathering and protest, but indoor churches could not gather, even with socially distanced protocols. He absolutely sees an issue. There have been several cases pointed to where people attending church in their cars were targeted by law enforcement officers. So that's unacceptable. People should be allowed to worship. We have a First Amendment in this country. There's a way to safely do it. I went to Mass and was able to safely attend distance from people, and there were appropriate protocols that were taken in that case, and that's what we hope to see, as the president made eminently clear a few weeks ago.
And that, not too long ago, he asked for all churches to reopen. Is he happy with the progress or no?
He's happy with the progress. I've seen, in fact, that very week, a church that I visited reopened, a church down the road from me. So I think he gave a lot of courage to the faith community to reopen, to do so safely. And look, here we are, I think 4 weeks later, and we haven't been hearing about, rampant outbreaks in places of worship. The First Amendment's a beautiful thing. People have a right to go to church or mosque or synagogue. Yes.
Yes, hi, Kayleigh, thanks. Still on COVID, the president seems pretty unconcerned so far about November and the COVID situation, whether people are going to be afraid to go to polls or whether there's going to be a lot of delays because of the COVID. He recently said it's a long way off, I think meaning that the pandemic would have died down by then, essentially. But given that it hasn't actually gone away, people are obviously still dying every day and there are some spikes, and it's not that far away, 5 months. Are any measures being taken at all to guarantee that this election is going to go smoothly and everyone who wants to vote can vote?
Yeah, well, I've not seen much criticism of the protest and socially distance and mitigation efforts.
About the election, not
I
protest.
think there's a way to safely vote if you can safely protest, and that's what the president would like to see. There's a way to safely vote. There's a way to safely go to church, and you're asking a hypothetical about something 5 months from now at a time, ironically, when the media hasn't expressed much outrage about a lack of mitigation efforts taken by some of the protesters.
Just wondering about the election. That's what everyone
Raquel.
cares about.
Thank you so much, Kayleigh. Two questions. First, is the president concerned the protest could lead to another outbreak of coronavirus? And a second question, President Trump said that he does not believe the death toll in coronavirus cases figures from some countries. Does he trust the figure from Brazil? Is the White House concerned that the Brazilian government is hiding information about COVID-19?
So I haven't spoken to him about the Brazil numbers, but I have heard him on several cases, probably at least 5, mention that he'd seen what's going on in Brazil, and he was hurt to see how many people have been affected by COVID down there. So he has mentioned Brazil specifically. I believe he even sent some ventilators to Brazil because we had such an overflow of ventilators here because America really, under the leadership of President Trump, snapped into action and shored up what was supposed to be a ventilator shortage. And delivered, this administration delivered. So I would just note that he's mentioned great concern for the people of Brazil.
Kayleigh, just the first question that I asked, is the president concerned the protests could lead to another outbreak of coronavirus?
Now we're monitoring that. Right now we're encouraged to see that cases have declined month over month, but the vice president, as I walked out here, said the task force is well aware of monitoring individual situations in particular states. Niels.
Kayleigh, thank you. Going back to where you started with the statement about renaming the military bases, if Congress were to send over, say, the defense authorization with language that were to rename one of these bases for someone who, say, was a general who won the Civil War, would the president veto the defense authorization?
The president will not be signing legislation that renames America's forts. It's important to note, Fort Bragg, for example, it's one of the largest military installations. It's home to tens of thousands of brave American soldiers. And when you think of Fort Bragg, we think of the brave soldiers that deployed from there. We think of all 5 World War II airborne divisions, the 82nd, the 101st, the 11th, the 13th, and the 17th, all trained at Fort Bragg. The 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, this was the first Black Parachute Battalion trained at this fort. We must recognize the sacrifices made by these men and women, some of whom saw Fort Bragg for the last time before they went overseas. We've got to think of the Fort Bragg soldiers that have led humanitarian operations like in Hurricane Katrina and the earthquake in Haiti. We've got to honor what has happened there, not rename it. So that is an absolute non-starter for the president. And I would also note,
One more question on that.
yeah, John.
One more question on that. General David Petraeus is one of those people who went through Fort Bragg a number of times, even though his first command was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He penned a quite lengthy and detailed editorial about the reasons why those bases should be renamed, saying it's ironic that American soldiers and Marines are being trained at bases named for people who fought against the Union back in the Civil War, that many of the people for whom these bases are named were leaders held in questionable regard, but who were elevated during the Lost Cause movement. He goes on to say, we do not live in a country to which Braxton Bragg, Henry L. Bang, or Robert E. Lee can serve as an inspiration. What does the White House say to that particular point of view?
Fort Bragg is known for the heroes within it that trained there, that deployed from there, and it's an insult to say to the men and women who left there the last thing they saw on American soil before going overseas, and in some cases losing their lives, to tell them that what they left was inherently a racist institution because of a name. That's unacceptable to the president, and rightfully so. And I would also note, where do you draw the line here? I'm told that no longer can you find on HBO Gone with the Wind because somehow that is now offensive. Where do you draw the line? Should George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison be erased from history? What about FDR and because of internment camps? Should he be erased from history, or Lyndon Johnson, who has a history of documented racist statements? And finally, what about people that are alleged by the media to be segregationists? NBC tells us Joe Biden didn't just compromise with segregationists, he fought for their causes in schools, experts say. CNN tells us letters from Joe Biden reveal how he sought support of segregationists in the fight against busing. Washington Post tells us that Biden's tough talk on 1970s schools desegregation plans could get him new scrutiny, and there are several more where that came from. So I'll leave you with the question, should we then rename the Biden Welcome Center? Thanks very much, guys.
One quick follow-up on
Hello, everyone. The transition to greatness has officially begun. Friday's jobs report was encouraging, to say the absolute least. The jobs in this country, we had more than 2.5 million added. The prediction was that 7.5 million jobs would be lost. This was a 10 million swing toward the positive side, and in fact, the greatest number of jobs created in a single month on record. That is extraordinary. 225,000 manufacturing jobs, 464,000 construction jobs, and 1.2 million leisure and hospitality jobs were all added in May. Beyond that, the number of workers who reported being on temporary layoffs decreased by 2.7 million in May. And more than that, and this was a great number that was pointed out to me today by the CEA, 300,000 jobs were created for Black Americans in particular. That's in May, and that was a 1.7% increase, so very encouraging numbers there from the CEA that they highlighted for me, BLS numbers that they highlighted. May's jump in average weekly hours also is an encouraging sign, because increasing hours is a sign that employers need to hire more workers to meet demand. For all private sector employees, average weekly hours increased by 0.5% to 34.7 hours, the highest level since the series began in 2006. 73% of small businesses are open. That is up from the 52% right before the April jobs report reference period. Also, workplace visits are up roughly 40% from its pandemic low. The stock market is absolutely soaring. We saw with the S&P that it had its greatest 50-day rally in history. The Dow, likewise, is also booming. The markets clearly have confidence in President Trump, the jobs president who created the hottest economy in modern history once and will do it again. Also, commentators and economists have noted how great this jobs report was. Yesterday, we saw Mohamed El-Erian, the chief economic advisor at Allianz, say this will go down in history as the biggest positive data shock for the markets and the economy, and you saw how surprised the markets were. They surged on Friday, capping a strong week with the NASDAQ closing at a record high. He said it was also very surprising to the economists. Not a single one thought that we would create jobs. Everybody expected the unemployment rate would go up. It did not. Also, senior economic correspondent at the New York Times, Neil Irwin, noted that we have to think that the May employment numbers count as a strong win for PPP supporters. Obviously, the president signed that into law and has been a big cheerleader of the PPP. Typical economists missed it by 10 million, as I noted at the top of the briefing. 10 million. That's bigger than the entire state of Michigan nearly, and that's how much economists were off. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because America has taken note of the fact that we have a president who ushered in the hottest economy in modern history, record low unemployment for Black Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for the disabled, for our veterans. Paychecks were beginning to rise under the President Donald Trump economy. We have the great jobs creator in office, and America clearly has confidence in this president. You have a president who fundamentally understands how to put this country back to work, and we saw that in action with the Friday jobs report. And with that, I'll take questions.
Okay.
So start with John.
Kayleigh, what's the president's thinking on this growing movement to either defund or dismantle police forces across the country, and what reforms does the president think would be appropriate in the wake of the George Floyd killing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The president is appalled by the defund the police movement. The fact that you have sitting congresswomen wanting to defund the police, notably Rashida Tlaib, notably Biden advisor AOC Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a former Clinton and Eric Holder spokesperson Brian Fallon, wanting to defund our police across this country, it is extraordinary. And when you think the left has gone far, and they couldn't possibly go farther, because we all remember the defund ICE movement. They want to defund immigration and custom enforcement, and now they want to defund the police. This is extraordinary. This is rolling back the protective layers that protect Americans in their homes and in their places of business. He's appalled by it, and it's remarkable to hear this coming from today's Democrat Party. As for solutions, he's talking through a number of proposals, no announcements on that, but he definitely, as he's noted, recognizes the horrid injustice done to George Floyd and is taking a look at various proposals.
Does the president agree with any of the mayors across the country who are saying, I think we can take some of the money from policing and put it toward other programs that could be effective in community development, which could lead to the potential for a lesser need for policing.
Well, let's be clear. If the mayor of LA wants to defund police, take money away from police, Mayor de Blasio, the mayor of New York, wants to take money away from police, that means cutting of police. That means reducing police departments. That means defunding police departments, if not getting rid of them entirely. No, he does not agree with that, and the rest of America does not agree with that.
I have two questions for you. As you are going over your reforms and what you think is needed, does the president feel that there is systemic racism in law enforcement?
The president's been very clear there are injustices in society. I've noted several for you that he's pointed out as a Republican primary candidate, noting the Sandra Bland video was absolutely horrible, noting George Floyd. There's a civil rights investigation into that. He definitely believes there are instances of racism, but look, he believes our law enforcement are the best in the world. He believes that by and large they are good people. The 750 who were injured defending this country from rioters and Antifa in the streets, as to be distinguished from the peaceful protesters, those 750 officers who were hurt defending our country were heroes, as was David Dorn, a police officer who lost his life, and Patrick Underwood, who also lost his life in the last week or so.
He doesn't think that there is systemic racism in law enforcement.
He believes most of our police officers are good, hardworking people, and there's a lot of evidence of that, and he has great faith in our police department.
Okay, well, my second question, does he still believe that NFL players who kneel as a form of protest against police brutality should be fired?
The president is very much against kneeling in general. The president has made clear for years that kneeling is tied to our national anthem, that it does not respect our military men and women across this country. He's not a fan of the kneeling movement. He's made that very clear, particularly because he thinks it's disrespectful to our military, as the kneeling originated at the kneeling during the national anthem.
Do you think they should be fired?
I have no comments on that. He is against the kneeling movement, though, as he's noted on Twitter as recently as a few days ago.
Say yes, he does still think they should be fired?
I have no information on that, and I have not talked to him about that.
Is there anything in the Democrats' Policing Act that the administration supports?
Yeah, that legislation, first of all, the text of it hasn't even been given to us. I've not talked with the president about that yet. He hasn't reviewed it yet. He's looking at a number of proposals, but there are some non-starters in there, I would say, particularly on the immunity issue. You had A.G. Barr saying this weekend he was asked about reduced immunity, and he said, I don't think we need to reduce immunity to go after the bad cops, because that would result certainly in police pulling back, which is not advisable. So he hasn't reviewed the legislation, but A.G. Barr, as a member of the administration, noted this prior to the proposal coming out.
Does the administration support the banning of the use of chokeholds?
Look, the president, again, hasn't reviewed this piece of legislation. The president is looking at what's a state issue, what's a federal issue right now. He's currently reviewing proposals, actually, on this very topic about police reform, so I'll leave it to him and not get ahead of him on that. But certainly we believe that the appropriate amount of force should be used in any police interaction with an individual.
But 2 weeks after all of this civil unrest, why does the White House not have a plan? The president said on Friday that his plan for combating racism is a strong economy. How does that work?
Look, that's an important part of combating racism, is making sure that there's equal opportunity for Black Americans in this country. This president, we hear a lot of words from Democrats about criminal justice reform, that they wanted this. Well, they got it with President Trump reducing racial sentencing disparities via the First Step Act. Democrats talk about economic opportunity for Black Americans and people in vulnerable communities, and this president has done that with opportunity zones. It was a good start, more than 900 places, creating private investment to help people get on their feet to start businesses in this country. HBCUs, record funding. This president has repeatedly, through his actions, stood up for the Black community, and a big piece of that is absolutely economic reform. And I'd finally note on the point of economic reform, the USMCA, these trade deals, the TPP, making sure that didn't take place, that directly advantaged hardworking men and women in Detroit who wanted their auto jobs. So his reformation with trade, and also opportunity zones is helping to ensure that Americans of all races have the same opportunity in the economic playing
You're
field.
saying he will eventually have a police reform plan.
He's looking at various proposals, so I won't get ahead of him. No announcements on that front, but he has been looking at them over the last few days. Yes. Yes.
Kayleigh, there are reports that the administration is going to be pulling troops from Germany. Can you say how many and when and where are they going?
Yeah, what I would say on that is first, we have no announcements at this time. I know there's reporting out there, but as of this moment, there are no announcements. The president's continually reassessing the best posture for the United States military forces and our presence overseas. I mean, we remain committed to working with our strong allies.
Will he consult Angela Merkel before making a final decision?
I'll leave that to the president. Again, no announcements at this time.
And just one final, the new Lafayette Square fencing, do you have any indication on when that might be removed or taken down, since the protests have become more peaceful, and who makes that decision?
Yeah, you know, I don't have any announcements with regard to the fencing. That's not something that's in White House control in terms of securing the perimeter. But what I would say is the president has recognized that the protests have largely been peaceful. Why have they been peaceful? It's because of the actions taken by this administration. If you'll notice, Minneapolis was in chaos until the National Guard came in, and then it was secure. You had outside here in Lafayette Park, I noted the 750 law enforcement officers that were injured across the country. Well, 1/5 of those were in D.C. and the vast majority in Lafayette Park. And once the National Guard came in, D.C. was secure. That Monday decision by the president of encouraging governors to surge the National Guard made the difference. And the president's recognized now that the protests are peaceful. He's recommended a winding down of the National Guard, very peaceful protest over the weekend. So with regard to the security of the building, not a decision for the White House, would refer you to Secret Service and Park Services on that. But the president has recognized the peaceful protesting and is encouraged by that.
Yes, Jen.
Kayleigh, on Hong Kong, can you say when will the administration revoke Hong Kong's trade status? And also, do you think that that move would be the only thing the administration does? Is there something else planned? And do you think that China will listen? Are you seeing any signs of China relenting on Hong Kong?
Yeah, we haven't seen any updates from China thus far. No announcements with regard to the timing of that, but the president has been very clear that China's replaced its promise of one country, two systems with one country, one system, which is what led the administration to make the announcement that it would begin eliminating policy exemptions that were given to Hong Kong, the special treatment that they once had.
Kayleigh?
Yes, Steve.
Is there any, a week after what we saw in Lafayette Park last Monday night, are there any people here in this building who believe that, or does the president believe that perhaps things went the way they shouldn't have gone? Is there any regret on the part of the president or anyone here about how people were treated, people who were peacefully protesting, and how they were rushed out so violently?
No, there's no regrets on the part of this White House because, look, I'd note that many of those decisions were not made here within the White House. It was A.G. Barr who made the decision to move the perimeter. Monday night, Park Police also had made that decision independently when they saw the violence in Lafayette Square. And when, before these protesters were moved by Park Police and they issued that tactical order, there were 3 loud warnings. And as I believe it was A.G. Barr on Face the Nation noted, that some of those protesters moved back and adhered to the warning, but others of those protesters started hurling objects, and that was unacceptable. And Park Police acted as they felt they needed to at that time in response, and we stand by those actions.
The country and the world saw this violent clash between people who were otherwise peacefully protesting, but really the president is not sorry for the way things went?
No, the president is sorry about the fact that Antifa wreaked havoc in our streets and the failure of some members of the media to note that. Like CNN's Chris Cuomo said, show me where it says protesters are supposed to be peaceful. Well, I'd point him to the First Amendment where it says that you have the right to, quote, peaceably assemble. He should go back and read the Constitution. There are many others out there, like Don Lemon, saying that rioting is a mechanism to restructure our country. Burning down St. John's, using a pick to literally like carve out, as we saw in that video, concrete from the sidewalk to hurl at officers, that's not peacefully protesting. The actions of the rioters were not in keeping with the First Amendment. And I think the media needs to recognize there's a discernment between the peaceful protesters, many of whom I've seen, and the rioters. And yes, America will act against rioters. And yes, under President Trump, he will not allow burning buildings, 150 federal buildings to be defaced, and 750 law enforcement officers to be injured in our country.
Can I ask you one more about the president?
Ryan.
Just
I like the blue suit.
Oh, thank
That's
you.
a really snazzy look. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, you do know that the burning of St. John's happened on Sunday nights, and a lot of the violence that you were talking about, that happened on Sunday night. What he was asking about was Monday, when, as anyone who was down there knows, it was almost exclusively peaceful, especially in the moments before the chemical munitions were used on those protesters. So do you just want to clarify that about the burning of St. John's? Because that happened on a different day.
Yeah, the burning of St. John's is what prompted the decision to move the perimeter. It's what prompted Park Police to say that evening, the perimeter must be moved. It's what prompted, yes, it's what prompted AG Barr to agree with that decision on Monday morning that the perimeter needed to be moved. But when you hurl objects at Park Police, when you don't move after 3 orders are given, Park Police acted appropriately. When the shield of Park Police was batted down, when one person tried to grab a Park Police officer's weapon, that's not peaceful by any definition of the word.
And one question on
Yeah.
the area in front of the White House is now officially known as Black Lives Matter Plaza. Does the president agree with that decision?
I haven't talked to him about it. Haven't mentioned that to him. Yes.
Kayleigh, does he agree in general the way that Mitt Romney stated over the weekend he does with the core message of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, Mitt Romney can say 3 words outside on Pennsylvania Avenue, but I would note this, that President Trump won 8% of the black vote. Mitt Romney won 2% of the black vote. I believe President Trump, people across the country recognize that while Mitt Romney has a lot of words, notably he said that 47% of the nation is dependent upon government, believes they are victims, believes that the government has a responsibility to care for them. Those were Mitt Romney's words not too long ago. The president takes great offense to those words. That's not America. Guess what America is? It's when given opportunity via a Trump opportunity zone, belief that Americans of all races can rise to the occasion and achieve, belief in HBCUs and giving record funding to HBCUs, because we need to enable education in our country and school choice. Those kind of actions on the part of the president stand in stark contrast with the very empty words of Senator Romney. Yes.
Thank you, Kayleigh. As you have noted, the president has talked about the protest, he's talked about the death of George Floyd, but he still hasn't given a formal address to the nation. Why is that, and are there plans for him to do that anytime soon?
So the president has addressed the nation on this. I know several media outlets chose not to cover it, but when he was down in Florida last Saturday, he said, and I have the whole thing here, as he said many times, the death of George Floyd on the streets of Minneapolis was a grave tragedy. It should never, ever have happened. He spent several minutes going through this. In fact, half of his speech saying, I understand the pain that people are feeling. We support the right of peaceful protesters. We hear their pleas. And he went on and on and on. He said on Monday, I am your president of law and order and an ally of peaceful protesters. So he has said it. Some in the media have chosen not to cover it. Those words are out there and they're documented. Yes. Ebony. Yeah.
Thank you. Obviously, we're hearing a very optimistic message from the president about the jobs numbers and the stock market recovery. But in an executive order on Thursday night, the president said that he had determined that without intervention, the U.S. faced the likelihood of a long economic recovery with persistent high unemployment. I'm just wondering why we're hearing 2 messages from the president and how the American people are supposed to feel about the economy for the rest of the year.
Yeah, well, the president sees Friday as a great stride toward what he ultimately wants, which is this rearing economy that we had where paychecks were growing and at the fastest for low-income workers. We were at a very good place before he chose to stop the economy to save 2.1 million lives potentially. So he took the action that was necessary at the time. He wants to get us back to that place we were at. He's the one who can do it. He's noted there's going to be a time of recovery. He thinks that Q4 will be good, next year will be great. Monday was a great, an unexpected note that the market believes in this president, that employers believe in this president, that they believe they can open their doors in the Trump economy. So it was a note of a great first step of progress, but rest assured there are many more steps that we have to take to get back to the hottest economy in modern history, but we will get there under President Trump. Yes.
Sure, Kay. Sticking with the economy, New York City began reopening its economy today after a very long lockdown. Does President Trump think we need another coronavirus stimulus package? And if so, what would he want to see in it before he signs it?
Yeah, he's remained open to a phase 4. There was some discussion about this. There was a meeting last week at the White House about that, actually. So won't get ahead of him, but he has said there are several things he wants. Payroll tax holiday was one of them because that directly advantages low-income workers. Several other things that he would like to see in the package. Won't get ahead of him, but he's certainly still open to a phase 4. But it can't be, as he's noted, just state and local bailouts for blue states that have run their states into the ground because of decades of Democrat policies. Chanel.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Would President Trump support an actual increase in police funding to help offset some of the damage that could be waged on departments that are defunded across the country?
Yeah, so again, that would be getting ahead of the president on that exact proposal, but he's been very clear he does not support defunding the police in any way, shape, or form. He noted, in fact, just a little bit ago to me that we have seen violent crime come down in this country. And why, at the time when violent crime's coming down, why would we defund the police, who are in large part responsible for helping America to get to a place where our streets are safe? So I would point you to that and before getting ahead of the president on a specific policy.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Louis.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about defunding the police movement, what's going on. How does it impact the crime scenario here?
You said, sorry, I didn't hear the last word.
Defunding the police, how does it impact the crime scenario here? The crime rates are going up. Do you think that will impact the crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Here? Look, our police officers are the ones who are defending this country and making sure that we have law and order in our streets, and there's no more evidence of that than just taking a look at the raw numbers. Our police are described as the blue line in American society between peace and chaos, between order and anarchy, and that thin blue line has done quite a bit. Just looking at 2018 numbers, murder arrest 11,970, robbery arrest 88,130, aggravated assault 395,800, violent crime arrest 495,900. That's police officers who are doing the arresting. You eliminate police officers, you will have chaos, crime, and anarchy in the streets, and that's something that's unacceptable to the president.
Do you think this
Frank?
is political in nature? The
Sorry?
entire movement is political in nature? Is politically motivated, this movement?
This movement, what the president believes is, look, when you look at, I would just take at their own words, Black Lives Matter DC, and Black Lives Matter DC said Black Lives Matter means defund the police. So if that's what the movement means, of course the president stands against defunding the police. All Black Lives Matter, including the life of David Dorn, who perished in the last week and a half, including Patrick Underwood, who also lost his life this week. All Black Lives Matter, but in terms of the movement Black Lives Matter, they define themselves as defund the police, and that's something this president stands against. Frank.
Yes. Blacks are disproportionately arrested and disproportionately incarcerated in this country, and when they return to society, they are often denied the right to vote, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Is the president concerned about this disparity, and does the president favor restoring the rights of all those who complete their sentences so that they can participate in the 2020 election?
So I haven't spoken to him on that issue specifically, but what I would note is your question does edge on the notion of criminal justice reform. Obviously, someone who's wrongfully incarcerated, that we need to address that situation. And the president has, with the First Step Act, a great piece of legislation that says pregnant women can't be shackled when they're having their baby in jail. These are basic, common sense, human decency reforms that the president put in place. The sentencing disparities that are at play because of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, that crime bill, which has been derided, and rightfully so, by civil rights leaders. This president helped in part to rectify that. And I'd note that the First Step Act, the beneficiaries, more than 90% have been Black Americans. So this is a president who's always stood on the side of justice, but I have not spoken to him about that specifically. Is there anyone who I haven't gotten to?
Could you ask him about that?
Emily.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question on behalf of myself and then one from a colleague who couldn't be here.
Sure.
So many complaints were made against Derek Chauvin prior to the death of George Floyd. And I was wondering if President Trump believes that disciplinary records and complaints against police, as well as police personnel files, should be accessible to the public. States have differing laws on this, but should there be a minimum national standard on police transparency with respect to these complaints and records?
Yes, it's a good question, but again, it would get to what the president's going to propose going forward, so I won't address that or get ahead of that. But the particular incidents you reference of George Floyd, it was egregious, and that needs to be looked at and is being looked at, not just at the state level, but at the level of the DOJ as well.
Thank you. And from a colleague, does President Trump urge Prince Andrew to comply with his Department of Justice's request for an interview in the case against Jeffrey Epstein?
I haven't spoken to him about that, so I would not get ahead of him on that. John.
Kayleigh, a couple of questions on coronavirus, if I could. Is there any thought being given to returning to, if not a daily coronavirus briefing, frequent coronavirus briefings? And on the reopenings, the president said some weeks back that he would continue to monitor the situation and that if any states were doing things that he didn't think were appropriate, he would step in to intervene. Has the president, in any of these reopenings, particularly as coronavirus cases are increasing, which could be due in part due to increased testing, is he seeing anything that gives him concern?
So I would note this. First, Dr. Burke sent me some new information before coming out here that new cases have stabilized, and many of the new cases are being identified through proactive monitoring and finding asymptomatic cases. Today, we saw the lowest new mortality report since the end of March, less than 500, and testing continues to expand with over 20 million done and more than 6% of Americans being tested, and in 7 states, nearly 10% of the population. So we are heading in a positive direction even as we begin to safely reopen.
But again, has the president seen anything that causes him concern?
I would note again the encouraging signs put forward by Dr. Birx. He's seen the country safely reopen, and I would also just note some of the media contradictions here, certainly not referring to you specifically, John, but just a cry about social distancing among the protests. And I mean, I saw one network with footage of the Ozarks and complaining about social distancing in the Ozarks, and then seamlessly transitioning into protest footage and not suggesting that there was a problem with the lack of social distancing. So I think we have to be very consistent here. And one note that I really wanted to get in, should have weaved it in earlier, but I think it's important, is just there's so much focus on our police officers right now. There are absolute cases of injustices. Our heart breaks for those cases, but I just want to note some of the great things our police have done last year alone. In Alaska, retired cop Kim Castro jumped in freezing water to help victims to safety after a plane crash. In Idaho, a woman said, "He saved my son's life," commenting on a cop who saved her disabled son. In Maine, a detective was killed while helping a motorist. In Rhode Island, a baby who was choking was saved by an officer. In Maryland, an officer was hailed for intervening in an active shooting incident. North Carolina, police thwarted a mass shooting. In Ohio, police took down a mass shooter at a bar. In Wisconsin, a terminally ill girl was visited by 40 officers and canines. In New York, Officers Bies and Officer Roman of the NYPD responded to an incident involving a homeless man. They bought him new glasses, a haircut, and a new suit, and they helped him to find a job. In Detroit, Michigan, an officer helped a homeless man struggling to shave in the streets. In Virginia, officers could be seen playing with little girls, playing dolls with them on the street. And in Arizona, Charlie called 911 asking for a Happy Meal mistakenly, and police delivered. This is who our great law enforcement officers are, and we should remember that. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. The president has made clear that what we are seeing on America's streets is unacceptable. Violence, looting, anarchy, lawlessness are not to be tolerated. Plain and simple. These criminal acts are not protest, they are not statements, these are crimes that harm innocent American citizens. The First Amendment guarantees the right of the people to peaceably assemble. What we saw last night in Washington and across the country was not that. To that end, President Trump is demanding action to protect American citizens, to protect American businesses. 17,000 National Guard are deployed in 24 states, but according to General Milley, only 2 states have deployed more than 1,000. There are 350,000 National Guard available overall, and for the lawlessness we are seeing, far more needs to be done. Governors across the country must act, deploy the National Guard as it's fit, and protect American communities. As President Trump has said repeatedly, it's very important that we have peaceful protesters and support the right of peaceful protesters, but we cannot allow a situation like what happened in Minneapolis to descend further into lawless anarchy and chaos. And we understand that very well. And with that, I'll take questions. Yes.
To your point, the country is in crisis. There's a global pandemic that has claimed more than 100,000 lives. At least 40 million people are unemployed. There are now protests and racial tension ripping apart many cities. Where is the president? Why has he not delivered an address to the nation, as many of his predecessors have in a time of domestic crisis?
So the president has delivered multiple statements on this. The president, as recently as 48 hours ago, was out talking about what a tragedy the death of George Floyd was, how it has weighed on his heart, and how he encourages peace and lawfulness in our streets and peaceful protests. So he has said that repeatedly. He's made many statements to this effect, but what I would note is continual statements, as he's made day and day and day and day again, they don't stop anarchy. What stops anarchy is action, and that's what the president is working on right now.
To that point about the anarchists, you said this morning that the president is focused right now on rooting out Antifa. George Floyd did not die in Antifa custody. He died in police custody. What's the president doing to reform policing tactics and excessive use of force by police?
Yeah, so it's an important question for sure. And this president, if you look at the actions his DOJ has taken, there's a civil rights investigation into the death of Ahmaud Arbery. There's a civil rights investigation into the death of George Floyd. It is a tragedy what we saw. I mentioned to you that the president was extremely upset when he saw that video. And he continues to, the DOJ continues to pursue those charges. And he's recognized injustices for a long time. Since he was a candidate, he talked about Sandra Bland and what a terrible video that was too. So he recognizes injustices where they are, but at the same time, he also recognizes that we can't allow organized groups like Antifa to commit some of the heinous acts that we've seen. John.
Kayleigh, in his call with the governors, the president said that he had put General Milley in charge of all this. What does that mean?
Yeah, so
Joint Chiefs of Staff in charge of policing American streets. What did he mean?
So I'm not going to get ahead of any actions that will be announced, but what I will say to you is this, that he has had 2 briefings today with Secretary Esper and AG Barr, and General Milley was there, and there will be additional federal assets deployed across the nation. There will be a central command center in conjunction with the state and local governments that will include General Milley, Secretary Esper, and AG Barr, but I won't go any further in announcing what actions.
But can you explain what the president meant when he told the governors, I have put General Milley in charge? What does that mean? Because that